Let me ask you something, and I want you to sit with it for a second before you answer. When you are at your absolute lowest, not just tired, not just sad, but genuinely broken in a way that takes weeks of real hard work to begin to piece back together, who shows up? Not in theory. Not in the version of the story you tell yourself when things are good. Who actually shows up? I know the answer to that now. I did not know it on a gray Tuesday in March when I walked out the front doors of Collingwood General and Marine Hospital with a plastic bag in one hand and absolutely no ride home. My name is Alec Drummond. I'm 64 years old. I spent 37 years as a finished carpenter in Simcoe County, the kind of work that lives in the bones of your hands by the time you're done with it. My wife, Ruth, passed 19 months ago from pancreatic cancer, the kind that announces itself late and moves fast, and I have one son, Liam, who is 31 years old and works in commercial real estate in Toronto, 2 hours south on the 400 if you're lucky with traffic, 3 hours if you're not. He knew I was being discharged on Tuesday. I had told him twice. The discharge coordinator, a capable and patient woman who had clearly had this exact conversation with families more times than she could count, had called him the previous Friday. She had asked him to confirm a pickup time. He had said he would be there. I stood outside the main entrance in a March that had not yet decided whether it wanted to be winter or spring, the particular sullen gray of southern Georgian Bay country when the snow is mostly gone but the cold hasn't gotten the message, and I watched cars pull through the circle drive without stopping for me. I was holding a plastic bag that contained my watch, a phone with a cracked screen, an 11% battery, the house keys I had cut when Ruth and I moved to Stainer in 1996, and a get well card signed by the nurses on the third floor. There was no cash. I hadn't thought to bring any. The ATM on the second floor had given me $40 before my session timed out. 2 20s I folded into my shirt pocket because I wasn't sure what else to do with them. $40. 7 weeks of learning to speak properly again, of squeezing rubber balls until my left hand remembered what squeezing was, of lying awake at 3 in the morning, listening to other men's monitors and thinking about Ruth and thinking about what I had almost not come back from. And $40 was what waited for me on the other side. I want you to understand what those 7 weeks actually looked like, because this isn't a story about a man who had a little health scare, took a rest, and walked out refreshed. The stroke had come on a Sunday in late January while I was replacing a cabinet door in my own kitchen. Left side of my face went first, then my left arm went heavy, then the floor came up faster than seemed fair. I don't remember the ambulance. What I do remember is waking up on the third floor 3 days later with a physiotherapist named Brenda standing at the foot of my bed, asking me to tell her my name. It took 4 seconds. That doesn't sound long. At the time, it felt like a life. The speech was the worst part, more than the weakness in my left hand, more than the fatigue that sat on me like a second body. I had always been able to say exactly what I meant. 37 years of working with clients, talking through a project, explaining why the wood grain needed to run a certain direction, why the joinery mattered even where nobody would ever see it. And for 3 weeks in that hospital, I had to slow down, find the words carefully, the way you feel for footing in the dark. I did the work, every session, every exercise, every humbling minute of it. And Ruth wasn't there. That was the thing underneath all of it, the current running below everything else. For 33 years, she had been the person I told things to. Not just the big things, the small ones, the shape of an ordinary day, the sounds the floor makes in a house that's settled, what we would do someday with that piece of waterfront in Muskoka. We had owned that lot since 2003. 3/4 of an acre on a small lake outside of Huntsville, not on the big tourist lakes, where the prices go to places that don't make sense, but a quieter lake, mostly local families, a gravel road in, and the kind of evening light off the water that Ruth would drive 2 hours for without complaint. We had always called it the someday property. Someday we would build the cabin, someday when Liam was older, someday when we had more time, someday. I was standing outside the hospital, thinking about Ruth, and trying not to count the minutes too, obviously, when I heard someone say my name. Alec Drummond? Not a question, an identification, like whoever said it had been carrying it ready and was finally able to set it down. I turned around. He was in his late 30s, solid in the way that comes from real physical work before life takes a different turn. Short dark hair, a few days of growth on his jaw, wearing a canvas work jacket over a fleece that had seen better days. He was holding 2 Tim Hortons cups, and he had the particular expression of a man who has rehearsed something and is now deciding whether the rehearsal is still necessary. I knew that face the way you know a song before the title comes back to you. Travis, I said. Travis Holbrook. I had taken him on as an apprentice in the autumn of 2002 When he was 19 years old, the son of a friend referred to me because he'd dropped out of college and needed direction more than he needed anything else at that point in his life. He had shown up the first morning in new work boots that were going to cause him grief and a willingness to learn that you either have or you don't, and you can't teach the ones who don't. He had worked with me for 4 years. 4 years of cabinet work and custom mill work and finished carpentry, of learning to read the grain and trust the measurement, of the kind of work where the difference between close enough and exactly right is the difference between something that lasts and something that doesn't. He had been a good apprentice and a better young man, and somewhere around year 3 I had started giving him the projects that mattered, because I trusted his hands as much as my own. He had left in 2006 to take an accounting certificate at Georgian College, which had surprised me and which I had eventually understood. Some people build things with wood, some people build things with numbers. Travis, it turned out, was both. I hadn't seen him in over a decade. "You look good," he said, and then considering. "Considering," I agreed. He held out one of the cups, double, I still remember. I took it, because there's not much else you do when someone you haven't seen in 18 years shows up in a March parking lot outside a hospital with your coffee order memorized. We stood there for a moment, the kind of silence that exists between people who shared something real and haven't needed to perform anything since. The cold off Georgian Bay working its way through my jacket. I felt something shift in my chest quietly, the way good wood settles into a proper joint, not dramatically, just correctly. "How long have you been here?" I said. "Since 8, it was 20 past 11. "Travis, it's March." "I brought coffee," he said, completely unbothered. I looked at him for a long moment. "How did you know I was being discharged today?" He looked back at me steadily. "I've been paying attention for a while now, Alec." There was something in the way he said it. The sentence had weight to it. Not the weight of bad news exactly, but the weight of someone who has been sitting with something they needed to hand over carefully. "Get in the truck," he said quietly. "There are things I need to show you, and I need you to hear all of it before you do anything." I got in the truck. He drove a clean F-150, a few years old, and on the console between us there was a manila folder, not a thin one. We pulled out of the hospital loop, and he talked as he drove, steady and measured, the voice of someone who had arranged information in the right order and intended to deliver it that way. Travis had become a forensic accountant. After Georgian College, he had gone on to get his CPA designation, had worked for a firm in Barrie for 8 years, and now had his own practice, the kind of work that gets called in when numbers don't add up and someone needs to find out why. He had heard about my stroke through mutual acquaintances. Small county information travels the way it always has, and something had made him start looking. He didn't explain it beyond that. Something had made him start looking. "Your brother-in-law," he said, "Glenn Mercer." The name landed in the cab of the truck differently than names usually do. Glenn was Ruth's younger brother, 8 years her junior, who had always existed in the particular category of family member that you accommodate for the sake of someone you love. Not malicious, I had always thought. Just a man who believed that what was good for Glenn Mercer was generally good for the situation, and that with sufficient confidence, the two things could be made to look identical. When I had the stroke, Liam had been the one to contact Glenn. He had driven up from Toronto in a panic, my son, 21 hours into not knowing whether I would recover. When Glenn arrived at the hospital with a document and a suggestion, I was incapacitated. Someone needed to manage the practical thing, bills. The hydro, the property tax. Glenn had a notarized power of attorney, he said. He had been preparing one anyway, he said, in case of exactly this kind of situation, because someone in the family needed to think ahead. Liam had signed as a witness because he was frightened and exhausted, and Glenn was Ruth's brother, and that was supposed to mean something. Travis opened the folder on the console. The POA Glenn used was backdated. The notary who commissioned it had their license suspended by the Law Society 14 months ago for exactly this kind of practice. They're currently under RCMP investigation in connection with 3 other cases. He turned to the next page. Your Muskoka lot was transferred out of your name in week 3 of your hospital stay. Transferred to a numbered company. The numbered company has a single director. He didn't say Glenn's name again. He didn't need to. I looked at the document, my own address, the legal description of a piece of land Ruth and I had driven to in every season, in snow and in the green heat of August, through every one of the 21 years we'd owned it. The lot where she had once stood at the water's edge at dusk and turned around to look at me and said, quietly and with complete certainty, "Alec, this is where I want to be old." The transfer date was the 19th of February. I had still been in the ICU on the 19th of February. There's more, Travis said. He said it the way you close a door carefully, because the thing on the other side of it is fragile. Your RRSPs, your joint account that was never retitled after Ruth passed, a GIC that matured in February, Glenn moved them. Not all at once, which is smart, or would be smart if the pattern weren't so clear once you know what to look for. He's been systematic about it. The kind of systematic that doesn't happen by accident. I sat with the numbers. I had been a Finnish carpenter my entire working life, not a wealthy man, but a careful one, and Ruth had been careful too, and together we had built something decent and solid the way we'd tried to build everything. Properly, over time, because it would last. He's done this before, Travis said quietly. I looked at him. Not in Ontario. He was in Alberta for 4 years in the early 2000s. There was a civil suit in 2008. He settled confidentiality clause, but the plaintiff's former lawyer is still in practice and was willing to speak generally. He paused. Glenn picks people who are grieving, people who are compromised, people who have someone who trusts them enough to hand them the door. The truck was quiet. Outside, Simcoe County moved past the windows, the gray-brown fields of March, the bare maples, the flat light of a season that hasn't decided what it wants to be yet. Liam, I said. Didn't know, Travis said immediately. Glenn told him you weren't ready to leave, that the medical team had flagged some concerns and needed more time to evaluate you. He told Liam you had actually called him, that you were overwhelmed and needed someone to manage things quietly, that you were embarrassed to ask Liam directly. I sat with that. My son had not chosen not to come today. My son had been managed, precisely, thoroughly, by a man who had counted on Liam being too worried and too young and too much in need of someone steady to question the version he was given. He thinks I'm not ready to leave yet, I said. He thinks, Travis said, that you walked out of there today with no resources, no car, and nowhere to go, and that the problem you represented has essentially resolved itself. That was the most important thing. The moment Glenn knew I was out and aware, he would secure legal counsel, move whatever assets remained, and the question of recovery would become a question of years. So we let him believe it, I said. Travis glanced at me from the driver's seat, not to check whether I was serious. He already knew I was. He was measuring something else. There's a township council meeting, he said, 3rd Thursday of April. Glenn's buyer, the developer the numbered company sold the Muskoka lot to, needs a minor variance approved before they can proceed with any construction. Routine application. Nobody's going to object. He paused. Unless there's an outstanding title dispute registered with the Ontario Land Registry. I looked at him. I filed it 6 days ago, he said, allowing himself a small, precise expression that was not quite a smile. The variance can't proceed until the title question is resolved, and the title question cannot be resolved without the signature of the legitimate owner. He paused again, who is not currently incapacitated. I looked out the windshield at the passing county road, and I thought about Ruth. About the way she had said someday, standing at that water's edge, as if someday were a place you could drive to when you were ready. About how she had always known exactly what to do in the middle of the things that were hardest. I thought about how much she would have liked Travis Holbrook, and how she had in fact always said he was the best apprentice I'd ever trained. She was right, she usually was. Travis had a spare room in his house outside of Barrie, clean, plain, a window that looked out at a stand of white pine that the wind worked through and a sound I found I could sleep to. He had stocked the fridge with enough food for 2 weeks and left a note on the kitchen table. Don't call Liam yet. Don't call Glenn. Let me know if you need anything. I didn't call anyone. I made myself dinner, leftover soup reheated on a gas stove, and I sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of someone else's house and I thought about patience. The kind of patience that doesn't come naturally. The kind that has to be built the way good joinery is built, deliberately, with attention to what you're actually constructing, not just how quickly you'd like to be done. Glenn Mercer believed he had already won. He was living in that belief, moving around inside it, making it comfortable. I was going to let him stay there for as long as it took. The next 6 weeks were quiet on the surface and not quiet underneath. Travis and I met at his office, a modest second-floor space on Bayfield Street in Barrie with 2 degrees on the wall he'd never bothered to frame properly, and we worked through the documentation methodically. The fraudulent POA, the illegal notarization, the transfer records, the sequence of account movements. A forensic accountant, I discovered, works the way a Finnish carpenter works. Not quickly, not impressively, but with complete attention to the places other people don't bother to look, and complete confidence that the invisible things are exactly the things that matter. Travis had been in contact with a woman in Calgary whose father had been defrauded in the 2008 matter. Her name was Janet Rafferty. She had spent 15 years knowing what Glenn Mercer was and having no one who could use what she knew. She drove out to meet us in Barrie on a Thursday afternoon, a composed woman in her mid-40s who shook my hand and held it a moment longer than a handshake requires, the way people do when the handshake is standing in for something that doesn't have a name yet. "I've been waiting," she said simply. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry it took this long." We built the case through March and into April, quiet and careful as anything I'd ever built in my life, while Glenn Mercer moved around his version of events without any reason to think they were being examined. The Township Council meeting was held on a Thursday evening in the Minden Hills Council chambers, a wood-paneled room with fluorescent lighting, and the particular efficiency of a municipal meeting that has 12 items on its agenda and zero intention of running past 9 o'clock. I arrived at 7:18, pushed open the back door quietly, and found a seat in the last row, left side. The room held perhaps 50 people, cottagers with concerns about road maintenance, a farm family there about a drainage issue, a developer's representative in a sport coat that was slightly too formal for the room, and Glenn Mercer, front row center, in a jacket I'd seen him wear at Ruth's funeral, looking the way Glenn always looked, settled, prepared, a man who had arranged things to his satisfaction and was present mainly to collect the result. I didn't make a sound. I set my coffee on my knee and I watched him for 4 minutes, and then, the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives, Glenn Mercer's head turned slowly to the left. He found me across that room the way a man finds the thing he has been trying not to think about. For a moment, nothing. Glenn's face was a careful face, years of practice, the expression of a man who has talked his way through difficult rooms and has learned to perform steadiness under pressure. But he had not been in a room where the problem he thought he'd eliminated was sitting in the back row holding a Tim Hortons cup. I watched his jaw tighten. I watched him turn back to the front of the room. I watched his right hand resting on his knee, close slowly into a fist, and then deliberately, consciously, open again. There it is, I thought. There's the crack. The variance application came up at item 8. The chair, a steady woman named Carol Bergeron, who had the energy of someone who had run 1,000 of these meetings, and was moved by none of the drama that occasionally tried to attach itself to them, read the item number and asked whether there were any outstanding matters before the committee proceeded. Travis stood up from 2 rows behind Glenn. Glenn heard the movement. He turned. Whatever color the last 40 minutes had returned to his face left immediately and did not come back. "Carol," Travis said, his voice unhurried, the voice of a man placing information on a table because it belongs there. "Travis Holbrook, forensic accountant acting on behalf of Alec Drummond. We have a title dispute registered with the Ontario Land Registry on parcel LT2248 being approximately 0.78 acres on Lake Clearwater in the township of Lake of Bays. The title dispute was filed 11 days ago. The parcel is the subject of the variance application before this committee tonight. Legal title to that parcel has been held continuously by Alec and Ruth Drummond since 2003 and has not been lawfully transferred. We have the complete documentation here for the record." He set a bound report on the council table with the care of a man placing the last piece of something he has been building for a very long time. The room did what rooms do when something real arrives, a kind of settling, a slight recalibration. Carol Bergeron looked at the report. She looked at Travis. She looked at the developer's representative, who was looking at Glenn. She looked at Glenn, who was looking at the front wall of the chamber and doing it with tremendous concentration. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "were you aware of any outstanding title question on this property?" The pause lasted 5 seconds. I counted every one of them. "I'll need to speak with my legal counsel," Glenn said. "Of course," Carol said. "We'll table item 8 pending resolution of the title matter." She made a note. She moved to item 9 with the efficiency of a woman who had other business and had not set aside time for whatever this was. That was it. No raised voices, no confrontation across a room, no moment anyone would describe as dramatic. Just a bound report and a variance that would not be approved. And a developer's representative already moving toward the exit with his phone out, his sport coat considerably less settled than it had been at 7:18. Glenn's project, the one built on a piece of land that was never legally his, funded with money that had never been his to move, suspended, pending resolution of a title dispute that would not resolve in his favor. I finished my coffee. I stood up. I went out the back door before Glenn had collected himself enough to think about following me. 3 weeks later, Glenn Mercer was served. The charges came from two directions at once because Janet Rafferty's Calgary lawyer had been coordinating with Travis for 2 months, and the picture that the two cases painted together was the kind of picture that requires no additional narration. Fraud, forgery, criminal breach of trust. A third charge connected to the fraudulent notarization and the notary who had been operating under a suspended license. Glenn's lawyer made some preliminary noises about contesting, looked at the documentation Travis had assembled, and made considerably fewer noises after that. Liam called me on a Monday morning, 9 days after the charges were filed. I answered before the second ring. There was a silence on the line first, the particular quality of silence. That means someone is carrying something they have been carrying for too long and have just now found the edge of. "Dad," he said. Just that, and his voice broke on the single syllable in a way that told me he knew. That someone had finally told him the full shape of what Glenn had engineered, and that he had understood it, and that he was feeling something closer to 20 years old than 31. "I know," I said. "It wasn't you." "He told me you didn't want." "I know what he told you," I said, "and I know you believed him because you trusted him, and because you were scared, and because you were trying to do right by me in the middle of something that didn't give you a good option. I know all of it." He cried then. My son, 31 years old, standing somewhere in his Toronto apartment, crying the real kind, not the held-together kind. And I sat in my room in Travis's house in Barrie, and I let him. Because sometimes the best thing a father can do is stay on the line without filling the silence with something that makes it easier. We talked for 2 hours. The most honest conversation we'd had in 4 years, since before Ruth got sick, since before the grief changed the weather between us, and we'd both quietly stopped knowing how to stand in it. The Muskoka lot came back. The title was clear by mid-June, the numbered company dissolved, the developer's deal unwound back to its starting point. The transferred funds were subject to recovery proceedings. It took time the way these things take time, but they came back. I built a small dock at the waterfront lot that September. Just a simple dock, treated lumber, nothing extravagant. The kind of thing I could do in 3 days with the right materials and a level and the particular quiet satisfaction of work that is exactly what it needs to be. Liam drove up from Toronto on the Saturday and handed me boards and held things level when I needed a second set of hands. And we didn't talk about Glenn, and we didn't talk about the months of misunderstanding, and we didn't need to. Some things you don't discuss so much as simply move past, together in the direction of something better. At the end of the dock there is a bench now. I made it myself, cedar, simple, the joints cut the way I've been cutting joints for 37 years. Not because anyone will ever inspect them, but because that's how you cut joints. On the back there is a small brass plate, ordered from a shop in Huntsville. For Ruth Drummond, who always knew what the someday was for. Travis sits on the board of the apprenticeship fund we set up through Georgian College. 2 seats per year for young people who want to learn a trade and can't absorb the full cost of doing it. We called it the Ruth Drummond Trades Bursary, because she would have approved of it precisely and completely, and because she was the kind of person who deserves to have something in the world that goes on after her. Glenn Mercer is working through a process that will take years. That's the nature of it. What I want to leave you with is not about Glenn. The person who betrayed you is not the point of your story, even when it feels like they are. What I want to leave you with is what I found in a hospital parking lot in March, standing in the particular sullen cold of a Georgian Bay late winter, holding $40 and a cracked phone and absolutely no plan. The person who was supposed to be there wasn't, and the person who showed up instead was standing there with my coffee order memorized because 22 years ago I had given him a chance and he had not forgotten it. Not because he owed me anything, because that is what decent treatment does when it finds the right person. It goes somewhere, it builds something. Sometimes it takes 22 years to show you what it built. You cannot always see where the good things you do are going. That is not a reason to stop doing them. It is, if anything, the only real reason to keep going.